What's happening, financial coaches? It's Pete here, and I want to talk to you today about my topic called Living Like Immigrants. And it was because I was doing a little reminiscent, thinking back on a couple of times that really impacted me meaningfully, right? It's not that I lived through these events, but it's kind of a realization of what I saw. And I got two stories here. It's a story about a guy named Hugo, which spelled Hugo. Hugo is Mexican. He was a friend of mine. He actually worked for me. And, one of the things that Hugo did for me was give me a glimpse into his life in a way that I didn't expect. And I learned a lot for, and it struck me. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about it. And it made me appreciate my parents' journey more. Particularly my grandmother, who I knew, and I knew where she lived, and I knew some of the history of her family. But it made me understand and appreciate what people lived like, and didn't think a second thought about it, right? And so I bring it up because can people live like immigrants? Because I think right now, even in the legal world, right, even by social services, there are certain standards that have to be met. I actually know a friend of mine that is trying to adopt a child, and there are inspections on how big their home is, how much play area, in square feet they would have, and how big the living space would be dedicated for their adopted child. And so, as an adoptee myself, it's kind of interesting because, if I wasn't adopted, my life would not have been particularly good. I don't know that I would have wanted to spend my life in a foster home or in a what do I call it? Orphanage, an orphanage. So, which could have been a very real possibility as kids get older. I don't know if you know this. As kids get older, just like as dogs get older, they are less likely to be rescued. Everyone wants to, not everyone, but a lot of people like to adopt younger kids. A lot of people like to rescue young puppies and dogs, right? The senior dogs don't get rescued. There are a lot of kids, 13, 14, 15, or up to 18, that really have very little chance of being adopted. Sometimes they go into foster care and things like that, but they really want a home. It's actually kind of heartbreaking. And so if you don't get out as a kid, that was a Magnum PI. That's my phone. If you don't get out as a small child, sometimes you're not going to get out at all. So kind of a tough situation. But so I'm really grateful for that. But I'm grateful that people are looking out. But I also think, man, wouldn't some of the adoptees be better off living in a room that might not meet the minimum size requirements by the law, but be better off than where they are? Anyway, but my point here is that was a total aside and left field tangent for me. But living like immigrants, right now, I think whether or not it's legally required, but I think a lot of us have this idea of how we are supposed to live. Even the term living wage implies that there is a certain minimum level that we are all supposed to live at, right? Home with property and a swing set in the back. I don't know. I don't know what everyone's opinions are on this. I don't know what everyone's vision of what minimum living looks like. But I actually had a guy working for me. He was a friend of mine at the time, Hugo, and we tried to keep a boss employee relationship. I didn't want to necessarily, especially when I was younger and having employees and direct reports for the first time. I didn't want to be a standoff boss, but I also didn't necessarily want to blur the line too much because I knew that I would have to make tough decisions when money got tight or people were performing or whatever it might be. But Hugo was kind of my right hand man at the time, and we had a little bit of that professional relationship. But one day we're working, and he's like, "I'm gonna go home and have lunch. Do you want to come with me?" And he had never offered it before, and I thought, why not? I don't know. I just like seeing people in their natural habitat. So I went with Hugo back to his home. This was in Chicago, and he lived in an area at the time called Humboldt Park. So it's it's the west side of Chicago, and the funny thing is I didn't really realize that at the time. And where I was living in Bucktown, you actually would go to Logan Square, and I usually didn't venture to Logan Square because it was kind of a lower income, a little rougher neighborhood. And then certainly not beyond it, certainly not the parks beyond that, and certainly not Humboldt Park. So he drove, and we drove there, and it's not like anything bad happened, but it was a lower income neighborhood, and I'm not sure what it's like now, and it might still be, but it was a lower income neighborhood. You could get cheaper apartments. They were older, pretty dilapidated, and he was living on the second story of a walk-up apartment, and we went in there and it was old. There was a lot of dust. The walls were plaster and very wavy with, you know, probably 15 coats of different paint that had been put on them. Everything was old. It seemed like right out of the 70s, to me. And, you know, clean for living conditions, but not like immaculate by any means. And I went in there and the floor was just plywood. This is one of the things I remember. So it was kind of like either hardwood pulled up or whatever. But instead of ever putting any flooring down, they just painted the plywood, and the plywood was peeling in a lot of places. It didn't look great. And I got to meet Ugo's wife, and she was doing the best she could. So she had some little plants in the windows and all this other stuff. I bring this up because they were living in an apartment, which now I would say was probably $600 a month. That would probably be my guess of what it was. It was 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, which you wouldn't think is that bad and a good deal for $600 a month. However, Ugo and his wife were living there, and Ugo had 2 children. Ugo's brother Jorge was also living there with his wife and his 3 children, and then Ugo's father and mother also lived there. So this was a very interesting situation where I didn't really pry that much, but when you get introduced to the family and I kind of asked, oh, where does everyone live? And they said, live here. I thought maybe in the same building or the same town or the city. That was kind of my thing. And then when everyone sat down for lunch and, she was making some like mushrooms and biscuits, and it was a fine, nice hearty lunch. And everyone sat down. Some people were sitting on the floor. The place was jam-packed full of people. And what I realized is that all of the adults lived in one room. So they had beds in there. So the 3 pairs of adults would live in one room, and all the kids, the 5 kids, would sleep in the other room. And then they had this kitchen and nook area, and that was it. There was no separate living room or anything like that. And so basically the kitchen and that breakfast nook, living room, I'll call it, it was very small, was kind of the common space for everyone. And the place was packed, and I realized, and if you need square footage, I'd call it 1,100, 1,200 square feet. Now, I will say that during the day, the men were out working, so they were generally gone. I assume the kids were at school, and probably the women stayed at the house or the apartment. But what I realized is that they were doing the best they could with what they had. And they were kind of pulling it all together. They seemed to get along great. It was, there was no arguing or shouting or anything like that. It seemed like, to be honest, maybe the tightest knit family I had seen in years. So there was some benefit to it. Now, if you had asked Ugo, do you want more space or more rooms or whatever, I'm sure that they would, and I'm sure that they were going to get there. But there weren't any excuses. He wasn't saying, oh, this is a situation that's just temporary or anything like that. It was just assumed that I had seen something like this before, and I really hadn't personally, but I wasn't also going to be shocked. You kind of go into your coaching side of things, like, but it wasn't, an abject horror or anything either. It just was people making do with what they had and making a good life out of it. Now, I bring this up because I knew growing up, my grandparents, my mother's side of the family, were immigrants. So they had come from Germany. I'm adopted, and settled in Iowa in a small farming town, and basically all the family moved there. So my grandmother and my grandfather and their parents and her brothers and sisters and cousins and the aunt and uncle, they all lived in this little house. And even when I would go there as a kid, and it was just my grandmother and grandfather, it was a pretty small house. And when you hear the stories of where everyone lived, my uncle, Eric, and his family, and, or the cousins and all that, lived in the attic. Now, I was told that, and the funny thing about it is I've been in that attic. It is hot and sweltering in the summer. It is cold and drafty in the winter. It is a place where I would worry about the stuff that I put in there to store, whether it's getting weathered too much, and to think that some people were living there as their room shocks me, right? And when I think about that now, and I think about Ugo and, what Ugo is doing, and Ugo is first generation here, as well as, my grandparents, and their family, I think about the fact that people at one point were willing to do whatever they needed to do. They were willing to live however they needed to live, and they looked at the bright side of things. And I will say that, honestly, their financial future was maybe secured because they were able to create a financial footprint for their life that was very small. In fact, my grandmother lived to 100 years old and died with money, after living in a nursing home. No one ever had to pay for anything for her, even though they grew up in the Depression, even though they never made any kind of money. I mean, my grandfather worked at a gas station his whole life. He raised bees for honey on the side. So it was not like these people were wealthy. They were not even what I would probably call upper class. I don't know that they ever made money above the poverty line. But you would never hear them talk about how terrible life was growing up. I don't even think that they regretted it, even when later they didn't have to, when they saw how their kids were living and how they were able to provide and all those types of things. So I'm not saying that some people should be living like immigrants. But what I think is that sometimes for a lot of people that I coach, the minimum bar is set so high. And it's not that that's a problem to have aspirations in life, but it is a problem when your income or your lifestyle provides a certain amount of living and you are living above it. This is a long way of saying that for people that decide to live below their means can do it. Because a lot of people say there's nothing else to cut. I mean, I think I said it before, but I've literally had people where I've said, listen, you need to sell you need to sell your BMW. I'm not selling a BMW. I've never driven anything less than a Mercedes my whole life. That's as low as I'm going. All right. So I just think it's, whether it's society or the Instagram lifestyle or social media or whatever it is, or just looking around, keeping up with the Joneses. Neighborhoods have gotten so nice. Schools have gotten so nice. Neighborhoods, downtowns, communities, that people are so conditioned now that there's a certain minimum standard for living that they have to maintain. And if they think about it, if they want to reverse it, if they want to think outside the box, if they want to get rid of all of those preconceived notions, to say, is it okay to have 5, 6, 7 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment? It's probably not great. It might not be up to code in many places, but could you do it? Could you convert that basement into an apartment for some of your family members? I even had some carpeting redone, and the gentleman that was installing the carpet was telling me that he just carpeted someone's garage because they were turning that into a room for some of their family that had come from another country for a while. So doing what you need to do, I think, is the key. And I'm not telling people that they have to live that low. I'm not telling people that they have to make that kind of sacrifice. But what I am saying is that I think a lot about what can I do to help undo people's notions about minimums, right? That I have to have this. It's a non-negotiable. And it's not like I'm trying to tear down people's value systems, but I'm just trying to get them to rethink it, because sometimes if we can move one or two of these levers that we think are rigid or absolutes, sometimes we can have some breakthrough moments where all of a sudden, you know what? I don't need to spend $1,000 a month renting. I can spend $300 a month renting. Spoiler alert, if you ever want to know, I'll tell you about how I got an apartment in the city of Chicago downtown for $350 a month. It meant making sacrifices on pretty much every measurable dimension of an apartment. But I was paying, $600 less than my closest colleague at the time. So you can do it. So living like immigrants. I love the philosophy. I'm not saying on an absolute basis or, a verbatim, that you have to do exactly like they're doing. You have to go to those extremes. What I'm saying is that the idea of living like immigrants might help you undo some of the thoughts that you have about minimum. So hopefully that helps. I'll see you later.